So, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I hope it's an interesting evening. Given a talk like this, obviously everybody has their sort of their hobby horses and the things they're really interested in. And I've struggled to kind of cut back the information a bit because I think I can, among the many things I could be found guilty of, are is information overload. You all know the struggle with chronic fatigue syndrome, and I want to give you what I think about it, what I have found having sort of been interested in the treatment of chronic unexplained illness for 40 years, 45 years, I suppose, all my career. So I was, conventionally trained GP, and I came from a non-medical family, and I thought I'd learn an awful lot in medicine and keep all my patients happy and get them better. And I found very often people would say, do you know what? I'm not feeling any better. And you'd be very disappointed because your magic wasn't working. And that got me very curious. Now, I did internship in Dublin, went off GP training in the UK, then came back here for a year or two, then went off to Canada, was in remote northern Canada, and it was very interesting. Delivered babies, did lots of emergency room work, but people would come in and once they hadn't got a diagnosis that was in the books, and I used to get obsessive and spend lots of money on textbooks. I'm afraid once they didn't have those diagnoses, well, you could politely offer them the old antidepressants and things like that. And so I was a bit short on ideas. I became very involved in learning things like acupuncture and found that reasonably useful. I got involved. I did the Canadian acupuncture training and then did the American acupuncture training. And the great thing at the UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles continuing education was there was lots of doctors who came to teach, and we'd all go out together and got a lot of idea exchange with people who were, I suppose, maybe older versions of what I was then. I was sort of 30 something, and they were 60 something or almost as old as I am. And so you learned a lot off those people. My career, qualifying in 1980, for instance, I first heard of fibromyalgia about 1986. Remember sending a patient with chronic pain down to Edmonton and being told fibromyalgia. That was a new word to me. So nowadays, where do I learn from? I suppose really it all happens in the States. There's a bit of European stuff, and I go to, European conference every year, every 2 years. But there's a lot happens in the States, and a lot of the sort of the advanced kind of cutting edge stuff on chronic unexplained illness. And the people that taught me, they're there. And another person who taught me a lot was Neil Nathan, and probably some of you have come across that. And I know Neil because I got to know him, but I would also have used him in the sometimes in three-way consultations when I was trying to learn more about biotoxin illness. Now, there's, the old story, there's a lot of things I wish I'd known, and I hope I'll be saying that in 5 years' time and be alive to say it. But anyhow, so I want to look at what there's we know a lot more about fatigue than we did, but what we don't know is a lot more than what we know. So let's look at some theories of causation. Why do people get stuck? I suppose that most of the people that really I learned from were Americans, I'm afraid. So I don't think there's a bit happening in Europe. There's nothing happening in Ireland. I don't think anything much happening in England. Now, so I'm just saying that our knowledge is probably outweighed by our ignorance, but that's probably always going to be the case. So why do some people get stuck in illness? And I wanted to just mention the cell danger response because it's a guy called Robert Navio, an American. It's the cell's burglar alarm, and the mitochondria shift into protection mode. Um, it's an ancient survival mechanism, but the problem is the alarm gets stuck in the on position. And people need to move from the alarm phase to the repair phase to the recovery phase, but they get stuck in the alarm phase. And this really does over the mitochondria. The metabolism slows, there's fatigue and inflammation, which was previously to attack the invader. The inflammation persists, and that's where your brain fog comes in and where the pain comes in, and normal functions shut down. It's another version of, I suppose, flu like illness, because why do we get sort of sick as hell with the flu? It's because of our cytokines. And the cytokines are a go go when healing gets stuck. What gets things going? Repeated infections or stressors, environmental toxins, overwhelming triggers, genetic vulnerabilities. And I'll mention a little bit about that, about mold in a few minutes, and life events. I'd find that a lot of people who I see have had trauma. And remember, trauma doesn't have to be one big awful event. It can be chronic, persistent, low grade. It could be a very difficult teacher in school. And for some people, it's someone who broke their spirit 20 or 30 years ago, or God forbid, it can sometimes be now as a parent of adults. I think back, it can be parents as well and stuff like that. So the hit and run, the danger comes in and hits the cell, but then it runs. So you've got the cell stuck in a danger response, even though the attack is gone. And you can get things like distorting, reverberating loops in the spinal cord because you've got inflammation around nerve cells. It will swell on nerve roots and create more inflammation around it, and it'll make other nerve roots more sensitive. It'll sensitize. So you got to break that loop. And in standard medicine, we were all taught, look, what's the diagnosis, doctor? Medical students would be asked by the tutor, putting a bit of heat on them. And then and they might, so you'd be very much taught about the one diagnosis. You would have your one, two, three for your differential diagnosis and why it might be one, why it might be two, why it might be three. All treatment would follow from diagnosis, and saying there's a bit of this and a bit of that is not acceptable. Whereas really the model of fatigue is multifactorial. The model of chronic illness is dominoes. So the old cause was, the old thinking was find the cause, remove it, and you're cured. Now we have to think about multiple triggers and the same pathway. The cell danger response, the body perceives danger, and both physically and emotionally, you have to soothe the body and make it feel safe. Because when the body doesn't feel safe, it ain't going to heal. Now, diseases linked to persistent um, cell danger response, fatigue, CFS, fibromyalgia, post traumatic stress disorder, autoimmune conditions, long COVID, traumatic brain injury. I suppose we're realizing that a thump in the head is going to cause inflammation. Now, I now want to switch to something that I really only learned about the importance of mold in probably about 2016, 17. I saw a book by Neil Nathan, one of his old books, and then I noticed he published a new book called Toxic. And that book taught me a lot. Now, there's also a guy called Joseph Brewer, who's an infectious diseases guy in the States. And Brewer wrote a lot about mold. For instance, in the late 1990s, he was involved in a paper which showed that a very high percentage of sinus infections are not bacterial, they're mold related. But he also did a study on It was about maybe 150 chronic fatigue syndrome patients and found that over 90% of them had mold in their urine. Now, mycotoxins. Now, that does not, association does not imply causation, but we don't have anything else to go on. And I suppose I have tested this out in reality with hundreds of patients and found it pretty reliable. What is mold toxicity? Mold and mycotoxins, they go in and they disrupt cellular function. They get into your little mitochondria. They can perpetuate the cell danger response. And biotoxins are bipolar. They have a water soluble and they have a sort of a carbon and hydrogen soluble end. So they can wiggle their way through any membrane and invade. I'm just going to keep an eye on the time there. Common is this, Ireland's damp climate. Often people will say, "Look, I'm worse in winter time," and in some climates, for instance, sinusitis can be worse. We'll say in some areas, we'll say in the States, particularly where there'd be a very wet autumn and then the frost comes. In a wet autumn before the first frosts, there's a lot more leaf mold and things like that. So think about mold is probably more common than we think. It doesn't have to be a visibly water damaged building, and people have their brewery, people who bloat in their abdomen, a lot of them will have a fermentation reaction. It's sometimes called autobrewery syndrome in their gut. Some people have a genetic susceptibility. They're not good at detoxifying mold. There's a 75-25% split. You can have, we'll say if you have five people working or four people working in the same office, we'll say it's all female staff who might chat more about the meaning of life, etc. And they say, "Oh my God, that one, she's always complaining." So it's on average, it's going to be one of the four will have the HLA vulnerability, and the other three will say, "What is that devil going? What is she going on about? She's complaining again." The body's main detox organ is the liver. The liver, if you can't deal with your mold via the immune system, it gets sent to the liver and bound in the bile and sent in the gut for release in the stool. The problem is a molecule of bile goes round on average 2.5 times. That's why if somebody has diarrhea, you say, "Oh, you need to take extra birth control precautions," because it's relying on the circulation of the estrogen molecule from the pill 2.5 times on average. So our body conserves bile and it conserves the mold toxin. What are the symptoms of mold toxicity? They are that great word protein, widespread, like fatigue, sinus problems, brain fog, fingers, rarely, fungal toes fairly frequently, other respiratory problems like asthma, recurrent infections, like a lot of people with mold problems will come in with infection after infection after infection. Athlete's foot, itchy ears, vaginal thrush, especially for people in the reproductive years. When there's less estrogen around after the menopause, you'll generally see less thrush. Abdominal bloating, people, "Oh, the sugar's the devil." They'll say, "When I have the sugar, it bloats their abdomen." Other people who have mold on board will be very sensitive to, we'll say, red wine, which is full of mold, even if I do drink it, and they'll notice their sinuses hissing like geysers. And then itchy tail end is very much part of mold. You'll get very often, you can get neural inflammation. We used to think that um, the 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 glial cells, that is connective tissue in the brain, not the neurons. It was considered to be the packing and the padding for the precious neurons. But no, it's actually immune tissue, which is very, very active. Alcohol intolerance, often people who have mold load will be drunk very quickly. They may find that they do much better with spirits rather than with wine, asthma, autoimmune, chemical sensitivity, and mold and mast cell problems. And I'm going to talk about mast cell in a few minutes. They love people with EDS, Ehlers-Danlos, who maybe, and there's a kind of a spectrum in Ehlers-Danlos, but some people will have um, just be a little bit double jointed, but often that kind of person finds their way to me rather than the person who has, the traditionally tight joints. You'll see a lot of hypermobile joints in folk who come in to see me. That's because the linings of their circulation tends to be different, and stuff muck kind of spreads more in the body. And you have the neural inflammation, anything from autism has neural inflammation to mold to Lyme disease to head injury. Now, it's interesting, it's worth mentioning. I would see a fair number of kids with autism or autistic symptoms, and when they will have at the age of 3 or 4, big load of mold toxins. There's a very interesting test that people can do. This guy called Richie Shoemaker did a lot of the work on mold, and it's called visual contrast sensitivity testing. Often people will find that their gray vision, their dim vision is very poor. So you could go online and look up the visual contrast screening test just out of interest. And environmental evaluation, if somebody has a mold problem or fatigue, and they'll say, it's only a bit in the bathroom or a bit behind the wardrobe, be careful, because um, often there's a whole lot more unseen where that is seen. So visual contrast screening, interesting for any of you to do, worth taking down. And then urinary mycotoxins, lots of labs do that. They're all American based. And environmental evaluation. Mold is treatable. It will very often have this mast cell thing. I'll talk a bit more about mast cell with it. But the big story is identify the exposure, get the gut going again. Often I'll see people who are constipated, and dear Lord, you really need it. I sound now like a district nurse saying you must have your regular bowel motions, but you really must have your regular bowel motions. Get the gut going, reboot the nervous system, because often nervous system will be wrecked and hypervigilant. That will happen with mast cell problems. And then obviously there's things like binders and detox support, but you need to pace how you introduce them. Lyme and co-infections. I made a decision. I had a bit of a dalliance with Lyme disease, but I found the treatment for Lyme disease is so, if you really want to treat it aggressively, you've got to be so invasive. There's a lot of IVs, a lot of antibiotics. And I said to myself, look, I'm probably going to be doing an awful lot more harm than good. And so I have shied away from it. And I generally say to people, look, if you have Lyme disease and you get better, and go to the Lyme doc, that's great. If you have Lyme and it's treated and you're not better, well, I will see people then. But Lyme, again, I think often the infection is gone and the body is locked in the cell danger response. And probably the cell danger response and the nervous system is what really needs to get treated, maybe rather than hammering them with more antibiotics when they have symptoms. I would see Lyme as an opportunistic infection. I've never, thanks be to God, had serious infection. Well, I did have hepatitis. I did with a finger prick, which was very serious, but I've never had anything like Lyme. But out of interest, I did my own the sensitive T cell testing for Lyme, and I found I had, a significant result, but I've no symptoms. I think Lyme is probably, in a lot of cases, an opportunist. It lives in people, and only when they are tired or immunocompromised does it come out and cause problems. So that's why I shy away from Lyme disease. And I think that the amount of oral and IV antibiotics used is probably not to my taste. So I'd say, look, excuse me, am I doing more damage than good? Let's talk about mast cells. Okay, I didn't really know about mast cell, I would say, till 2019, 2020. You'd hear about it, maybe even 2016, but you wouldn't realize quite how widespread it was. Mast cell is a cell, and I'm sorry, the illustrations didn't work out, guys. Mast cells are cells which are an intersection of the immune and the nervous system. They respond to both systems. What happens in activation is that mast cells get overactive and start to shoot off and cause problems at least provocation. And mast cells release histamine. Think about all those rashes, but they also will release a lot of other compounds. Literally, there are at least hundreds, if not thousands, of compounds released by mast cells. And in a lot of people with a chronic illness, the mast cells are totally, I'm doing on time, not bad, totally a go go. And what are some of the symptoms of mast cells? Um, Flushing, anxiety, GI symptoms, pain, neurological symptoms. Well, you all can read anyhow. Fatigue and post exertional malaise, light and sound sensitivity. People can get very, very sensitive. And I put in there the husbandry. Some women say, oh my God, when he chews, could he not stop that? And the poor devil is going like only a minor degree of chomping. Labels on clothes, fabric sensitivity, posh fabrics. People will say, no, give me soft cotton all the time. They'll cut labels off clothes, they'll cut labels off underwear, bras, they'll cut labels off trousers and panties, stuff like that. Very sensitive to stimuli because when mast cells are overactivated, the body starts perceiving attack, and the body can't distinguish between what's safe and what's risky. And that can actually go out into people's lives. And people, I'd sometimes say to people, could your mood turn? Yes, my mood can turn on a sixpence. And very nice people who are just sheer loveliness incarnate can be really blasted well awful to people and say, my God, I can bite the head off somebody. And that can be a mast cell problem. Why? Because, okay, we have histamine receptors in the skin, but we've histamine receptors all over the body and in the brain. And another mast cell thing, often they'll say, God, I'm so anxious. Another mast cell thing can be what the patient put to me recently, food coma. They they find themselves very upset, very tired after eating. What am I reacting to? Well, they don't know what they're reacting to because they'll react to something one day and they won't react to it another day. And that is the stuff of making people feel crazy. That is the stuff as well that will frustrate the allergists because they may not be aware that this person may have a degree of mast cell. And it sounds so inconsistent to, I suppose, to medical people and caregivers, and also as well with family. Honey, you were okay with that last week, and look at what you're doing this week. Are you sure now, honey? Are you stressed or whatever? Yes, stress does play a role because people's mast cells are much more activated when they're not well. But for me, beginning to learn about mast cell dysfunction, and I learned about it from Neil Nathan, really, really changed my practicing life. It was just fantastic. It just really gave me, and you must deal with mast cell is something that is secondary. It's related to something. Some of the immunologists will see mast cell as a primary thing. They might say, oh, well, there's more mast cell at menopause or perimenopause. But No, there's a cause for mast cell, and very often it can be mold or Lyme disease or infections or toxins because they get these immune cells supercharged, and mast cells are everywhere in the body, pretty well apart from the retina. But now I was just double checking on that one of the nights this week when I was preparing this. And there's kind of talk now about maybe some mast cells in the retina. So mast cells respond to allergens, infections, injury. Remember, injury creates inflammation. And when they're good, they create inflammation when needed. When they're bad, they create a whole lot of inflammation that you just do not need. Then I've mentioned unpredictable symptoms. What's wrong with you now, dearie? And there is no real, there's a lot of expensive tests available for mast cells. They don't tend to be available in Ireland. I mean, say when I'm ever at a meeting in the States, I see all the things that are available, and very often they're available on people's insurance as well from the kind of mainline labs. We don't have them here, but Dr. Nathan would certainly say, really have your clinical suspicions and treat. And if people respond to treatment for mast cell disorder, it's quite likely that that was it, because he would reckon there's no definitive test for mast cells. Um, Now, and I do generally test people's histamine, but remember, histamine it may be a very good histamine day, and there are definitely some people who will have a low histamine, even though they say, "Oh God, when I take antihistamines when I have a problem, they really help." There's something called tryptase as well. Anyhow, treat if clinically indicated. Usually the patient will notice, they will say, oh, antihistamines and various other mast cell stabilizer. They'll say they were game changers. That's the phrase people sometimes use. Mast cell dysfunction is common in ME and chronic fatigue. It's common in POTS, the postural orthostatic hypotension. And it is, that's where it is. Now, what can you do for mast cells? Antihistamines can help with people, the standard Claritin and stuff like that, but also ketotifen, which is a mast cell stabilizer. Obviously, trigger avoidance and treat the underlying cause. We'll say you've someone who's eating food. Well, a lot of us do that, I suppose, but someone who's eating food and having a meal, and the kind of person who'll get the food coma, they will have probably low-grade infection. They've got mold, bacterial infection. And what happens is their gut lining is permeable, and the half-digested proteins get across the gut lining into the immune tissue, and they start annoying the immune system. And then there's the massive histamine release and the tiredness. Um, and that's why some people say, I'm allergic to this, that, and the other food. And you do the food allergy testing, the IgG testing, which I generally do on people, and nothing happens. And that's because it's mast cell. But you kind of need to look at it still, though, because you don't want to miss a fixed food intolerance, whereas food intolerances generally are much more fixed. When I eat wheat, they'll say, I feel awful or whatever. Now, COVID-19 helped people with fatigue a lot, at least it validated things. I suppose for the first time, there was a recognition of post viral illness, that it doesn't all end super quickly. Long COVID and inflammation. So you've really got people locked in the cell danger response, inflammatory overload, cytokine persistence, and there's stress and limbic system disruption. Now, what is the limbic system? The limbic is your primitive emotional system. We'll say you've got the nervous system that kind of looks after your lungs and makes your heart beat, etc., and controls the heart rate. And you've got your cognitive brain that says, okay, it's Thursday, Thursday 8:10 or whatever it is. And then you've got your primitive or reptilian brain. It's one of our oldest brains, and that has an evolutionary purpose. It's to suss out danger, but often in chronic illness, the reptilian brain becomes overactivated. It sees danger where it is not. And you all probably know people who've had um, chronic illness who've become very risk averse. And that is part of that risk aversion, so that there is a kind of an emotional component as well as the biochemical. People, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to Mary's house or whatever it is. I might be afraid of who I'll meet, even though they only looked at me askance once 10 years ago. There can be a big metaphorical thing as well, right? And long COVID and ME/CFS, there's lots of overlapping pathways. Rebooting the nervous system. I learned this from Dr. Nathan. When people get stuck in the cell danger response, the nervous system can get stuck, and rebooting supports recovery. Your system must get to feel safe again. And I'm going to draw a bit of a sexist line between the genders here, the fellas and the girls. Um, Little girls, when they're 11 or 12, the periods begin and they say, "Oh, I've got a body, better look after it, better respond to it." Fellas, we all can think, "I've got a machine," especially, you're a very jockey guy, and he will ignore his body. And sometimes men, when they come, I say, "Look, I think you need to do some work on your nervous system," and they feel that's for ninnies. And it's maybe the seventh or eighth visit by the time I'm haranguing them, haranguing them, and haranguing them, and they go and do one of the neural retraining things to help their limbic system and their primitive brain. And they say, "Remember this guy saying to me, oh, well," he said, "that was a known goal, definitely." He found huge help in it. And, people will say, "I feel less restless." I remember this guy saying to me, and he was in a very high powered business job. "Bank holiday Mondays, I'm not totally restless all the time." People will notice things like if they have a busy day, they can settle down much more quickly. Because for a lot of people with fatigue, if they have a busy day, they can't get to sleep. Or like one patient told me recently, driving home, she worked in a hospital in Dublin, driving home, if she had to drive home later, she couldn't get to sleep after a day. So it's a really worthwhile thing. And I'm going to suggest a few avenues for people to pursue. And I think it's so worthwhile to pursue rebooting the nervous system. It sounds kind of soft, but it's very useful. So, what the nervous system gets stuck: persistent inflammation, tissue swelling, compressed nerves, and then the compressed nerves, like the nervous system is a bag of electrolytes, and you get altered electrical signaling. We are electrochemical at a very basic level. And then the reverberating loop, the pain starts to reinforce the pain, and the brain learns that pattern. Vagus nerve connection. And I want to say a little bit about the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve regulates heart rate, digestion, inflammation. It's called the vagus. Vago vagare is the Latin for wandering, because it goes everywhere. It starts in the brainstem. Um, it's um, it's the 10th cranial nerve, wanders everywhere. And when people are stuck in flight or fight, you have vagus nerve dysfunction because they're sympathetic. Their fight or flight is so activated, their rest, restore, and rejuvenate is not there. I will say to them sometimes, I just write WBT in my notes, wired but tired. Oh, yeah, I'm always restless. They can't sort of sit down on the couch, curl the legs up under them. They're poosing and toosing, doing this and that and the other. And vagus nerve, you need to gently reinforce your parasympathetic. And maybe it's worthwhile making a note of this, because all of us have, or have had children, and there seems to be such a, I suppose, an epidemic of anxiety among young people. There's a very good book, and now I'm going to tell you how to handle this book. You get it for Amazon 10 or 12. It's Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve. It's also on Kindle. Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve by Stanley Rosenberg. All of, I'd say, 12 or 14 euros. The theory is very interesting, but you don't have to read the theory. And with your kids or whatever, or with the anxious 14-year-old, and I'm not talking necessarily about children that have fatigue, I'm just talking about the stress of this always on social media world. There's 5 exercises. Get them to do 2 minutes per exercise twice a day, and it really will help. Rather than thinking about anxiety as being, as you know, Valium deficiency or CBT deficiency, like stop getting anxious. You can't analyze everything away, and a lot of anxiety is kind of it's the nervous system and biochemistry, and this really helps. So that's, I think, a really good thing for our parents, accessing the healing part of the vagus nerve. Stanley Rosenberg. The limbic system dysfunction, um, the patient becomes hypersensitive. They cannot distinguish safe from energy. Rebooting strategies address the inflammation. The inflammation generally is due to infection, but you got to start with the vagus nerve and the limbic system. And that's why people say, no, I want to go as fast as possible. You'll throw them under the bus if you do that. Vagus nerve stimulation, that's some of the things that are done, but that book is very good. And you'll see lots of stuff on YouTube as well. And humming and gargling, cold exposure. That's why, wild swimming, I'm afraid I never had the moral courage for it. Though I have a daughter who lives in Copenhagen, she went through a phase of going through 6 a.m. swims in Copenhagen Harbour in winter. And boy, she was looking great on it and feeling fantastic. And I did lots of letters for people, will say, to be able to drive to the coast during lockdown, because wild swimming can be good for people and good for the nervous system. Limbic system retraining. Okay, this is good. Oh, reorigin. I do know how to spell origin. Sorry, but anyhow, I'm not a great typist. Annie Hopper dynamic neural retraining system. The Gupta program. Reorigin. $300 to $500, I would say. Worth that. If you did nothing else, if you got nothing else out of tonight, and especially if you're anxious with sleep problems or whatever, for God's sake, do that. Really, 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 really worth it. Now that's Hopper and Gupta. Yeah, remove the triggers, stabilize the mast cells. Well, I'll just, you're begging people to get going on the vagus nerve stuff and on the neural retraining and all the rest. And then when you get them going with that, you can often begin then to come in and treat the mast cell, the histamine problems. And remember that often those people will say to me, oh, do you mind flicking the curtains, please? Because the curtains in the room, ordinary light will get at them. Or they'll be modeling Jackie Kennedy down in Tyrrell's Pass wearing the shades all round. And the people in the shop will say, gee, your woman, she's got a lot of attitude. Anyhow, because normal stimuli are difficult for them. The healing environment, the mold-free space, reduce the chemical exposures, supportive relationships. I don't believe people can't really heal if they're in very difficult relationships. And that includes even our work in relationships, because God, I don't know, we spend a third of our life at work. I know our nurse would talk about, don't know if Catherine's on tonight or not, but as her husband has a do and she had to maybe look after her daughter. But She would talk about her work family. Like we all need working relationships as well as our family relationships. And equally speaking, working relationships can be negative for people. So we need all of our relationships. Now, I might talk more about low dose naltrexone at the end. Medications that can help, it can help to get the immune response more even. I kind of reflexly would prescribe low dose naltrexone. It is so helpful. Sometimes you don't know that the person is benefiting from it because they'll say, "Oh, I'm seeing them in 2 weeks or 3 weeks," and they'll let their low dose naltrexone run out, and you don't notice the change within a day or two, but they'll say, "Oh, yeah, I need it again. I really need that," even though one hadn't noticed it was benefiting. DHEA can be a bit like that as well. Low dose naltrexone, the binders, well, the binders really are for the mold, the mast cell stabilizers. So, we've got the ketotifen. You can use, I would use herbal and natural ones as well. Targeted antibiotics generally don't come into I don't use antibiotics. If you're using antifungals for mold, I used to use them pretty liberally. I used nystatin because it isn't absorbed from the gut, and I used ketoconazole, Nizoral. But when you do that, mold really, really, really begins to fight because mold produces its toxin as a territory gainer. And it says, well, God damn you, you're trying to come in my territory. I'm going to get more aggressive. So I'm someone who uses the binders, change the gut environment, and it works very well. Graded exercise, never was a fan. I think that's too much like people putting horses on the lunge. Slow, gentle movement. Someone who I think is very good is Lee Holden, Tai Chi. He does 10-minute mornings, 10-minute evenings. I'm kind of a bit lazy person, but I did my 10 minutes Lee Holden this morning. I want you all to know. And respect post-exertional malaise. Because it's the mast cells that are causing the post-exertional malaise. Now, what is post-exertional malaise? Practical example is Mary goes for a walk with the girlfriends and they do, a healthy 2 or 3 kilometers and she's just grand. But the next day or the day after, she's done for. And that is post exertional malaise. They were fine during it, and then you get the mast cell activation and it comes. The role of psychological support, trauma informed approach. I do not spell emotional, by the way, again. He's protesting too much. Anyhow, it's not a psychological illness, but the role of stress on the immune system, on mast cell, is huge. So people must be in a healing environment. And also, people will sometimes start telling, like, I will hear a lot of sad stories, I'll tell you. And I would say to them when they're further on into it and feeling better, like, don't address emotional monkeys early on when you're weak as a kitten, because start addressing emotional stuff. It's like taking out amalgam too early. The person isn't ready for it. But further down the road, I would say to people to use that opportunity to heal. Because where life is a constant process for all of us. We're all wounded. Healers are wounded. We're all wounded. And it is a sort of a hint to us, illness as metaphor that we need to maybe do things with ourselves. Right. What do we kind of do? I eventually came to the conclusion that I needed to have a whole lot of arrows in my quiver, standard medicine. And I still love the fact that I had a standard medical education and did GP training, did the postgrad exams, and probably certainly for probably 9 or 10 years, the guts of those, even into the early 90s, I was doing a fair bit of general practice. It just became impossible to mix the two all the time. So you got to have a detailed assessment. I still think a medical history is really, really, really important. My favorite word, really. Anyhow, detailed history will tell me a lot. You need to do the tests as well. but history will tell me a lot. And often after a first visit, I will bring somebody back relatively soon. And from what I've heard, try and get their gut working at least, even while they're doing the tests. Mast cell evaluation, that's really part of the history. I'd probably do a histamine as well. Mold screening, I would almost always look at mold and toxins. Gut and mitochondrial support, you got to get that gut going. Like I'll read you some histories. And one of my ladies, she was only taking a trip to the bathroom, God bless her, every two. Now she's now a daily communicant, but she was, going once every 2 or 3 weeks. So no wonder for a start she was sick. Then IV therapies. Sometimes I thought IV therapies were American hogwash. The time again, and um, I did the intervene IV training in, let's think, about 1995 in the States. And I said, this is just American baloney and sales. But I did get, when I came back to Ireland, I got the IV preps and the stuff and the stands, but I didn't use it. Then my back was against the wall. And I said, I'll try an IV in this person. Now, I obviously didn't know what I know now, but I'll tell you, it really made me realize that intravenous nutrition, despite the fact that it's not sort of officially blessed in medicine, is very useful. But I think it is kind of, I do think it's been prostituted probably a bit as being used as, a hangover cure, which is not to say that I wouldn't go in occasionally myself. But, the thing of just sell it as a hangover cure or as trying to sell it as something to people to be having all the time, whether they need it or not, it has become too salesy. Ozone, medical ozone was a fabulous thing for me. I learned standard ozone, then I learned high dose ozone therapy because I met this patient who I hadn't got better. And I said, you're looking great. I said, what did you do? Oh, he said, went off to the States and had some ozone. I went to Germany. And within a few days, I was off to get one of the high dose ozone treatment machines. And I found it very useful, but not for everybody. And we should talk a little bit about viruses as well towards the end. Prolozone injections for joint pain, then unusual things like there's neural therapy. For instance, I will read you out one 60 odd year old patient who had a lot of scars and a lot of pain. Scarring on the body can cause pain. Patricia Kane's protocol, intravenous phospholipids and glutathione, those really do help to rebuild mitochondrial membranes and membranes of cell. Neurofeedback, there's a particular form of neurofeedback called IASIS, microcurrent neurofeedback, and I came across it in the States maybe about 2017 or 18, and it can be just brilliant. For when people are in sympathetic lock, it's one of the things when their sympathetic nervous system is overactivated. I had a young woman very much in fight or flight with, pseudo seizures, where people have kind of like sham epilepsy. But of course, that is often related to, guess what, mold. And she was told by the hospital, well, you'll never get better until you accept that those seizures are all in your mind. We dealt with their toxicity. The seizures weren't all in her mind. The time frame question, how long? Now, some of the people most of them have had, seven or eight consultations. Some of them will have had a fair bit of IV work. Some will have had things like neurofeedback. Dr. Nathan would say, I always tell people, months to years. And he said they often don't hear the S. Now, you're always trying to, in chronic illness, you're trying to manage expectations. I'm going to be really honest because it can be a very pressurized job because people think they're coming to you. They think, my God, I'm giving that guy a fortune, and that guy, of course, is spending a long time with you in a very intense setting. And I am going to address the finances of, our setup. But I need to lessen expectations on me and know what's realistic. But I would be hoping in myself that as they go on from month to month, literally, they will be improving. Often, you know, that thing about the 80-20 rule, when you bring the first 20 or 30% of things in, the most basic insights, and then you often work harder for the rest of it, both the patient and the doctor. But I'd say recovery is gradual, but it can, you know, it can move very fast for some people. And I'm going to give you four because I don't want to be I'm stressing the negative because I want to decrease the pressure on myself, but there's a lot of positives. What you can do now, consider your environment, like watch the multi-environment, for God's sake. Start vagus nerve exercise. I've given you the name of that. And remember, I think particularly with children, to keep them away from, being medicated, and it can really help them. Vagus nerve exercises, clean diet, improve sleep. Though a lot of you are doing all those things, gentle movement, Tai Chi. The pitfalls, the person who says, I want to get better yesterday, that is a problem and that is not good. And you will throw the patient under the bus. And sometimes people say, no, I want to get antifungals off you. I want to get antifungal antibiotics. And I know it's going to cause problems before they've done anything to stabilize their nervous system. You've got to pace the thing. Then losing hope is the other side of it because people are it's very hard because there's no paradigm for this. We've no paradigm for this in general practice as well, and that's hard for people. But it's really a very sort of specialized area, and it's an area where you have to have a mixture of medical skills and intuition, and got to spend a lot of time. I'll talk a little bit more about general practice in addressing one of the questions that were sent in. Um, don't go for the burn. Don't go for, I'll live with the with the burn. I live with worsening symptoms because I'll get better. People can go backwards if they try to go too fast. You're not broken. You're stuck in cell protection mode. There is a biological explanation and recovery is possible. And I just, I saw somebody in the question saying, well, he's very expensive. And of course, I sigh inwardly. And I assure you, I wouldn't be doing this kind of medicine if I wanted to have a bigger car. And, um, in our clinic, I would be away for several weeks study leave most years. There's conference fees, travel expenses, lost earnings. We've a lot of expensive equipment. We've long appointments. They're 50 plus for a follow up, 80 plus for a new patient. With things like IV supplies, special insurance for ozone. Our insurance would be triple what it is in the standard medical clinic. They're very safe, these things. Like if I was a doc in Spain, my standard medical insurance would cover me for ozone. It doesn't do it here. It's considered to be not evidence-based medicine. Patient needs individual support. The standard, ratio of staff, there'd be one doctor, you know, one doctor, four doctors maybe, and two staff, two admin staff, something like that. Whereas in our clinic, it's probably about almost two admin staff for one doctor plus a nurse. And we don't get any state subsidy. State subsidy can give people a lot, probably, you'll get 44 grand towards a practice manager. We get nothing like that. We've extra insurance. So we're, as well as having to pay out for much more expensive equipment, we're about 120 grand behind. So that's creating a net difference, probably, I'd say, of 200,000. Um, the average, GP or consultant is working on evidence-based medicine. It's much more streamlined. There's less head scratching, standard insurance, paid study leave. Um, it's it's a different world. Now we need our GPs too. And I have great regard for my GP friends and colleagues. But it's a different ball game. I can only see if I'm seeing in a busy, hard working day, I can see maybe three new patients and one follow up. Whereas, I remember one of my colleagues would say, well, I feel a bit stretched if I'm over 12 people an hour. you know. So the takeaways, think about the cell danger response, about being stuck, the the cells getting stuck in an inflammatory phase and how you have to release that inflammation, reboot the nervous system, get the gut working again. And recovery requires a multimodal approach. So when we do the question, PEM, post-exertional malaise, what is it, how it impacts patients? Remember, I said Mary goes for the walk 2 or 3 kilometers with the friends. Like kind of very easy going and a bit of a chat, a bit of banter, nothing too strenuous. And she's fine that evening, but the next day or maybe the day after, that's post-exertion malaise. It is due very much to mast cell activation because you get histamine and release of other chemicals. Okay. And now, barriers to diagnosis, lack of understanding in most GPs. Because I suppose I think that general practice can be very difficult. You've got to try and be all things to all men and women. When I was sort of growing up, when I was being trained, it was considered very important to tell people when you couldn't help them and to kindly sort of say to them, well, I accept the reality of your symptoms, but there's nothing we can do. Now, there might have been a bit of an undertone there, but that's what we were told to say, that it was kinder, that it stopped people consulting a lot. It stopped people consulting a lot and spending a lot of money and seeing sort of 30 different doctors. Um, the standard, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, the standard tests, like I still reaccredit as a GP, and in my GP continuing education group, we did a session on chronic fatigue. And, it was really what's their B12, what's their thyroid, have they got diabetes? It's very basic blood tests. And that's the problem. And especially if people have stuff like mast cell, they're saying, "My God, those those sort of weird symptoms." And things like mold will often have other symptoms like vibrating discomfort in the spine, um, and sort of electrochemical sensitivity, electromagnetic sensitivity, and people have those. And you know, doctors tend to think, "Oh dear, that's a bit strange and that's weird." Um, it's also perhaps cognitively difficult for us doctors. What I'm talking about now for GPs and for people who don't have a specialized knowledge, because you have to have faith in what you're doing. And as you go through a clinic in the morning of maybe 20 or 30 people, people have to feel that they're doing the right thing. So they have to use some yardstick, and the evidence-based yardstick is what they use. And because then they can feel at ease within themselves that they're doing their best job. So they don't really want to go thinking too broadly. Maybe am I getting this wrong? Because then if they start doubting themselves, they wouldn't know where they'll end up. They might end up like me, with a lot of people coming to see them who will challenge them. And, people, we all want, well, people tend to prefer life to be easier and straightforward rather than not. Differing levels of illness, severities of illness, from mild to profound, yes. I suppose it's different mitochondrial stuff, different hormonal stuff. I will make a comment that it's easier to help people who have somehow held on by their fingertips in work. Exercise intolerance, the importance of avoiding exhaustion, and how the term exertion. Now, I think we've kind of covered that. Post-exertional malaise covers that. The importance of correct advice, repacing and rest, dysautonomia and POTS, and cerebral hypoperfusion. well, you won't get, that's just what it really means is the carotid receptors here don't pick up the change in pressure when a person goes to upright. And dysautonomia is often caused by mold affecting the centers in the brainstem. The links to genetic connective disorders, I think that connective tissue disorders and EDS, Ehlers-Danlos symptoms, syndrome, and hypermobility of joints, it seems to be very important. The role of viral infection, related initiation of ME, and how to get tested. I would have, in my time, gone chasing viral illnesses. There are thousands and thousands of viruses on which one could spend millions and millions of pounds. And what I really say is, why did this person not respond? Why did this person not throw off the virus, and why did this person manage, their neighbor next door manage to cope with it very well? And I think that often at the root of a lot of that stuff, you have mold and mycotoxins. The body has chronic mycotoxin infection. I think this is what will happen, but certainly what I would see in certainly in some of the in the long COVID people, mold and mycotoxin happening, and their one hand is tied proverbially behind their back with by mold and myco. You deal with that, and then suddenly the viral infections begin to move. And I also find ozone very useful for persistent viral infections. Diagnosed at 35, now 64. That's tough for someone. But, I do think there's lots that can be done. Are my aches and pains worsening, brain fog, just old age? Well, I'm 71 and a half, guys, and I'm doing okay, thanks be to God. And I don't need a sugar-free life or a wine-free life. Is there any link with ME and MTHFR? There's a lot of people have methylation abnormalities and no problems. One is the genome, and it doesn't, but your genome may or may not be expressed. And it's more the environmental stressors that cause it. Say a lot of people are compound heterozygotes. I'm MTHFR, compound heterozygotes. I have one of each of the bad genes. And they say, in fact, a lot of professionals have them because they're a little extra bit driven. His experience of LDN, and a talk that applies to teenagers. The teenagers, certainly you'll see the teenager coming in school. Often they'll have nausea and a lot of belly problems and fatigue. And it's usually the ma who will come in to you with the kid. And it can be quite difficult getting the kid to take the stuff for the parents because the kid is, teenagers are teenagers. Many of us have had them as children, and they're often not the world's, they're not the queens and kings of compliance. Um, um, can he provide medical investigate for us to give to our own doctors? I don't know how well that would be taken. The preliminary standard blood test that we have, say everybody I see has got normal, pretty well standard blood tests. And I think the standard of general medicine and general practice in Ireland is very good. And a few years ago, I'd have seen the odd B12 deficiency or thyroid slip through. You don't see those. I still do them, but you don't see them. The standard of general practice is fabulous. The treatments he uses and what tests he does, well, I find most people find a lot of mold and biotoxin there, even if it started with a virus or whatever it started with, or if it was a slow, insidious drift downwards. I will also do foods. I'll do mold toxins. I'll do environmental chemicals, and I usually do heavy metals and look at all those things as well. And it'd be worth visiting them. You mightn't want to give up all of that. All I do, I'll give it that. I'm not worried. Um, some for various different symptoms and test results. Well, that's, I suppose, the art of medicine, and that if you've got 10 years, I'll teach you that. What advice would you give to patients in the early stages? I'd say try not to get stuck and try and get help. Um, some drugs which get gabapentin. Gabapentin is for pain. Look, your GP will know about that. Amitriptyline, GPs are very familiar with that. And then Tom had a last question about somebody saying anti-anxiety medicines that are natural. I would use sometimes for sleep, I'd use L-theanine and Melissa, and I don't find any problems with it. It works for a small but significant number of people. Melissa L-theanine. L-theanine is an amino acid. Athletes are allowed to use it in Olympic situations. Um, and then the other thing is magnesium that crosses the blood-brain barrier, neuromagnesium, or magnesium threonate, or I use another form of magnesium. I use different forms, but if you've got tight muscles and palpitations, it's probably well worthwhile looking at magnesium. And of course, often people won't absorb magnesium if they don't have enough stomach acid. So look at, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you've enjoyed it. I feel I was probably doing doing too much, squeezing it all in, but I hope it was worthwhile and enjoyable.